Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 285. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, September the 24th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. Today's essay is fourfold. 4 separate stories, all related, and the topic of this podcast, the title of this podcast is When a Big Problem Shouldn't Be. And what we're going to discuss today are 4 problems that I stumbled upon this week in today's news, most of which second-tier stories. But they're a big deal, and I scratched my head thinking, why should this be a big deal? I mean, it is. People say it is. The results of these 4 stories are causing people to set their hair on fire. But I scratch my head and think, why should this even be an issue? Why should this even be a concern? And I think a lot of this has to do with what's the word I want to use? The nearsightedness in the way that many of us, and I use the inclusive us because quite often I believe I'm included in those numbers, the way we don't look at things the way we should. We focus our attention on one thing one way, and then when that thing goes south, we lose our minds. And that's the topic of today's story. And there's basically 4 different stories. I'll talk about them briefly before I go into detail. But the World Cup is going to be in Qatar. And everybody's losing their mind because Qatar's a Muslim country and they don't want booze there. But if anybody should have a problem with this, it's the people that make the booze, and they're welcoming it. Story number 1. Number 2 has to do with a guy who is the head of the World Bank, and he's been asked questions and ostracized by many because of his stance on something that has nothing to do with the World Bank. Number 3 has to do with supply chains and how especially car companies are having to put cars on the side, not being able to sell them because they don't have a piece or 2 here or there. But the pieces that they don't have, you'll be shocked to know why they don't have them or what they don't have. And it has nothing to do with chips from China, by the way. Number 2, we could be in trouble because we could have a true beer shortage in the world. And the reason we're going to have a beer shortage in this world, there's a good chance we're going to have a beer shortage in this world, is shocking. In fact, the reason we're going to have a beer shortage in this world has something to do with why we have global warming in this world. But I'll talk about all 4 of those stories in detail. Before we do, being in St. Louis, being in the Midwest, being a baseball fan, something happened last night that was really actually incredible. Albert Pujols, who started his career as a Cardinal, is ending his career as a Cardinal, hit his 700th home run last night against the Dodgers. Cardinals won 11-0. Pujols first 2 times up, hit a 2-run homer and a 3-run homer. He accounted for all the runs in the game for the Cardinals up to that point. But the thing that has me shaking my head, and this is one case where I hope that I am so wrong, but for weeks they've been talking about this happening on this day, because this Major League Baseball game was not broadcast on Bally Sports Midwest. It was not broadcast on Big Fox. It was not broadcast on FS1. It was broadcast on Apple TV. So Apple carried exclusive rights to this game. And it was a game that many could not watch. Now, here's the problem. For weeks, they've been saying, wow, it looks like Albert Pujols it's a good chance he's going to hit his 700th home run on that Friday night in Dodger Stadium when the game's on Apple TV. And that would be awful. And I guess I've heard this story probably twice a day for the last 3 weeks. And then it happened. His first 2 at-bats, he hit home runs and tied the record. Now, is this coincidence? Maybe. Hopefully. I mean, I really hope it's a coincidence, because if this was a planned event, if they've planned all along for Albert Pujols to hit his 699th and 700th home run in Dodger Stadium on a Friday night when it was on Apple TV, friends, if that's really what happened and if it gets out, Major League Baseball is done. Let's just hope it was a coincidence. Okay, let's get into today's essay. When a big problem should not be. And like I said, I stumbled upon 4 stories this week, most of which were kind of major stories. None of them had anything to do with the war in Ukraine. None of it had anything to do about global warming, or at least most of it didn't. None of it had anything to do about Trump or Biden, okay? But there were 4 separate stories that people are saying, oh my gosh, this is terrible. How can this be? And I looked at all those stories and thought, this should not even be a concern. This should not even be a topic. This should not even be an issue. None of these should. Now, to be fair, all of them are. And I'll go into them in detail. The first one, and perhaps the biggest one, has to do with beer. In fact, we're going to go, the number 1 and number 4 are both going to have something to do with beer. I like beer. Most people do, okay? And it has to do with the World Cup in Qatar, which is coming up. I want to say next year, okay? The big soccer tournament. Qatar got it because, well, everyone thought it would be a good idea for it to be in Qatar. Never mind that Qatar is a totalitarian regime that is a big human rights violator, okay? That's not my opinion. It's a fact. Now, are the dictators rather benevolent? The people that live there believe so, but they're dictators nonetheless. They do not freely elect the people in their country. It's a very strict Muslim country. Homosexuality is outlawed. In fact, being in public with a woman who's not your wife is outlawed. Public displays of affection, even amongst married couples, is outlawed. Yeah, you can't hold hands and kiss your wife on the street. It's against the law in Qatar, okay? But they still thought it would be a good idea to put the World Cup there. And they've just told the homosexual community, you know what, if you want to go and watch a soccer game, you best not be close to your boyfriend or girlfriend. That's kind of what they've said. Basically, they said, yeah, we're going to let the gays in, but you better not gay it up too bad. Basically is what the country has told them. And the World Cup has basically told them that too. Yep, the gays can come, but don't gay it up too bad. Okay, fine. That's your rule. You decided to have it. But here's the big thing that people are losing their mind about. And it has to do with 2 things that go hand in hand. Soccer games, as the rest of the world calls them, football games, and beer. You can't drink beer at the World Cup because Qatar is a Muslim country. And the soccer fans are losing their mind. Now, I have to ask the question, why are they losing their mind? Because the world, you knew you couldn't drink beer in Qatar. That was never going to change. But the World Cup people who look at money and only money thought, you know what, they're paying more money than the rest, so we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Well, we're about there. So the soccer fans are losing their mind. But here's who's not losing their mind. Anheuser-Busch InBev. And you'd think if anybody should be losing their mind, it should be them, because they can't sell beer at a soccer game, at a football game. But here's what Budweiser's doing. They're promoting its alcohol-free lager at the upcoming Soccer World Cup in Qatar, balancing its role as the official beer of the event with strict regulations on the sale and consumption of alcohol in the predominantly Muslim nation. Now, executives from AB InBev, the brewer's parent company, believe the restrictions on alcohol sales in the country provide it with an opportunity to encourage more people to try its alcohol-free Budweiser Zero, which will be on offer at stations around the tournament inside the stadium's main bowls because you can't drink alcohol there. So they're pushing Budweiser Zero. In fact, Marcel Marconis, who's AB InBev's chief global marketing officer, says there will be millions of people watching the games, so it's a sizable trial opportunity for sure. In fact, AB InBev, that company, they want low alcohol and no alcohol beer products to make up at least 20% of its global beer volume by 2025. The current figure stands at about 6.5%. That's according to a company report published in February. Now, Budweiser will provide its flagship alcoholic brand only at certain venues, including its takeover of the W Hotel in the capital of Doha. That's according to executives. Now, alcohol isn't really illegal in Qatar, but it can only be purchased in a small set of tightly regulated places, like special licensing from special hotels. In fact, quote, we're working with the local authorities to make sure that we will absolutely comply with all the specificities of the regulation. And again, that's according to Mr. Marcotis. Qatar will relax its alcohol restrictions during the tournament, which is set to take place in the tiny state between November 20th and December 18th of this year. Spectators will be allowed to buy alcoholic Budweiser, for example, in designated stadium areas outside the main bowls before and after the game, not during. Now, the beer will be available only after 6:30 p.m. at the FIFA Fan Festival. That's an outdoor event in downtown Doha, billed as 29 days of football, music, culture, and lifestyle. Now, here's the thing, and here's what I don't understand. Why anybody is surprised at Qatar not allowing alcohol. Because they were never going to. But AB InBev is seeing this as an opportunity to push their Budweiser Zero. Now, a lot of you are rolling your eyes saying, Budweiser Zero, it has to be horrible. Actually, I've had it. In fact, I drink it fairly regularly. I'm trying to cut back on booze because I was probably drinking too much of it, let's be honest, okay? Is Budweiser Zero as good as Budweiser? Nope. But you can drink a couple cans of it at the pool on a hot day, and you're going to be fine. You can also, because, if I drink 4 or 5 beers at the pool, then 2 or 3 glasses of wine afterwards at dinner, I was going to wake up and not feel well the next day. Tired of doing that. So I'll drink Bud Zero at the pool, a glass or 2 of wine at dinner. Life is good. That's kind of the way I've been doing it. But a company spokesman at Budweiser has designated its World Cup brand activation to discourage harmful alcohol consumption and will also run what AB InBev calls its responsible beverage service, which trains bar owners and staff to help reduce underage drinking, binge drinking, and drunken driving. Because it is illegal to be drunk in public in Qatar. It kind of is in the States too, but it's not enforced if you're not driving a car. Local alcohol laws are only one nuance around the tournament. Now, FIFA and Qatar have for more than a decade weathered criticism over the 2022 World Cup, ranging from concerns over the protection of the LGBT spectators to the mistreatment of migrant workers hired to build new structures for the event. You may remember that story. I did a story on that a couple of years ago where thousands of these people were being imported in from especially the Philippines and South Asia to build these venues, and they weren't paying them much. Sometimes they were paying them nothing. There was forced labor, and many of them were just dying because they didn't take care of the people, and they just got more. And when Qatar was asked about this, they said, yeah, well, that's kind of just the way things are. But that's been a big deal forever. Now, AB InBev is not throwing a fit about this, and I think it's smart on their behalf, because how can I word this and not sound like a prude? The alcohol salespeople in many ways have the same problem that the tobacco people have, in that they peddle a product that kills people. Now, certainly you can drink alcohol responsibly and not have it be harmful. In fact, I think most people I know treat it that way. Okay. However, there's a lot of people who die of alcoholism too. So if they're going to sell a product, this might be a good opportunity for them to push their Bud Zero and the low alcohol drinks. In fact, that's one of the reasons I went from Budweiser to Bud Select or Bud Light. It's lower alcohol. You can drink more of it without feeling dopey. So bottom line is, this should not even be a story because FIFA knew what they were getting into when they admitted or elected to have Qatar host the World Cup this year. And the main sponsor of alcohol, AB InBev, is welcoming the alcohol rules to push their new no alcohol, low alcohol product. Okay. So none of this is a surprise, but people are still losing their mind because they're not going to be able to drink beer at a soccer game. Story number 2. There's a guy, his name is David Milpass. And I will tell you that there's a good chance that nobody listening to this podcast even knows who David Milpass is, even though he is one of the most influential, important, and powerful people in the world. Who is David Milpass? He's president of the World Bank. So, yeah, you've never heard of David Milpass. He just controls the world's money supply. That's all he does. Okay, not a big deal. He controls the world money supply. He decides who's going to put what in the kitty, who gets loaned what money as far as countries go, and at what rate they have to pay it back. So he basically is the chancellor of the exchequer for the world. All right, he holds the purse strings, the treasurer of the world. Okay. And there were calls of him to resign. Why? Did he make too big of a loan to a country who can't pay it back? Would he not loan money to people who he didn't like? Was there some type of sexual scandal involved? No, the answer was none of the above. In fact, Mr. Milpass, who was actually nominated to lead the World Bank by former President Donald Trump, spoke during an interview with Politico as to what's going on. Well, here's what happened. Mr. Milpass has been under criticism since Tuesday of this week over his response to questions, get this, regarding whether the burning of fossil fuels has led to rapid and dangerous global warming. This was at a New York climate event hosted by the New York Times. And basically, he was asked, what about global warming? What about CO2? What about our carbon footprint? And his answer was, I'm not a scientist. And people lost their mind. Now, he has since sought to clarify his positions amid an uproar on social media, which, by the way, I know I'm on Facebook. I know I'm on Twitter. I know I'm not. Yeah, okay. But I've had it up to here with social media, okay? You talk about an inbred, out-of-control, whack job forum. It's most social media sources. But I will digress because that's not what we're talking about right now. Mr. Milpass then said, look, let's get it clear. Greenhouse gas emissions from human activity are adding to, maybe even causing climate change. Mr. Milpass said in an interview on Friday because people were calling him to resign because he answered a question, I'm not a scientist, which, by the way, he's not. It wasn't the wrong question. Now, Mr. Milpass acknowledged that he didn't do his best job in responding to a comment by, he's still in the news. Former Vice President Al Gore, who called him a climate denier. Now, money is a sticking point in the climate change negotiations around the world, as economists warn that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius will cost many more trillions than anticipated. The Wall Street Journal and other publications have looked into how funds could be spent and who would pay. Okay. Now, when asked, "Are you a climate denier?" Mr. Milpass said, "Look, I should have said no." But then he called Mr. Gore's comment off topic at a seminar to discuss policy impact. The incident was unfortunate, Mr. Milpass said, because he said the World Bank is taking a forceful leadership position to address climate change. Now, here's my biggest question as to why this really shouldn't even be a story. This is a meeting at the World Bank, and Al Gore says, "What about climate change?" You know, once upon a time, I thought Al Gore was an okay guy. That's when he was married to Tipper. That's when he was a centrist. But then after he spent time with the Clintons, I don't know if he got a brain tumor or what happened to him, but he just went off the reservation. Okay. Divorced his wife, became morbidly obese, and then flew around the world in a private jet telling people to take their bicycles to work. I have no idea why anybody listens to Al Gore. Okay, so here's my dumbass giving Al Gore a moment in my podcast. So I guess I'm a hypocrite. But here's the thing. Mr. Milpass basically was asked a question that was off topic, had nothing to do with what they're talking about. And he said, "Look, I'm not a scientist." He didn't answer it yes or no. Basically, he was, as I like to say, dismissing Al Gore with the back of his hand like he was some brown boy with a turban who had just served him his tea. He didn't have time for it. Well, that's a mortal sin in this world nowadays. If somebody asks you a question about climate change, you damn well better say, "Why? I think it's horrible. I think we need to do this. I think we all need to ride our bicycles. I think we all need to stop burning all fossil fuels," except for China, because they're currently building 65 coal-fired power plants at this day. Other than that. But this should not be a story. This should not be an issue. This should not even be anything that was brought up, because this was a meeting at the World Bank that has absolutely nothing to do with global warming. But because he didn't drink the Kool-Aid and jump in bed with Al Gore in damning the West on their carbon footprint, many wanted him to resign the post of president of the World Bank. That to me is insane, and this shouldn't even be a story. But it goes on. I mean, when asked by reporters whether Mr. Milpass had the president's support amid calls for his removal by the president, not Trump, who appointed him, but Biden, who now is the president of the United States, of course. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said that removing him requires a majority of the shareholders, and reiterated that the administration will continue to press for the World Bank to address climate change. Now, the Treasury will hold Mr. Milpass accountable to this position and support the many staff workings to fight climate change at the World Bank. That's what Ms. Jean-Pierre said. Treasury Secretary Yellen has met with the heads of the multilateral financial institutions, including the World Bank, to press them to increase their climate finance amounts, step up their efforts to assist countries in reducing emissions, and better mobilize private capital for climate investments. So no, we're not asking him to resign, but basically you need to step up your involvement with global warming. Translation, you need to just write checks to the Church of Global Warming to help them out, okay? That does not include China, by the way. It does not include India, the two biggest polluters in the world, China and India, who are the two biggest polluters in the world and are going to be able to increase their carbon footprint, not even begin to think about reducing the amount that they pollute until 2035. Okay. And I'll mention two things that I mentioned last week too. The number one country in the world that has done the most to reduce its carbon footprint in the world the United States of America. Nobody else is close. Okay. The other thing, these developing nations that they want us meaning the West, to help in developing their economies without adding to the carbon footprint. The country of Uganda, and I mentioned this last week, this is a telling statistic. The country of Uganda, who has more people in it than the state of California, uses less electricity than the state of California uses to heat swimming pools. Now, if I live in Uganda and I have somebody who's the president of the World Bank or anybody from the West saying, look, you don't need to be building a coal-fired furnace. You need to keep doing things the way you're doing now. In fact, maybe you need to look at a hydroelectric generator, which would be fine except for you have a drought and you don't have any flowing rivers. Or maybe you should just continue to do things the way you are. You know, you don't need to have a coal-powered generator that pollutes so much to bring electricity into your house so you can have an electric stove or at least a hot plate. You need to continue to cook your food using horse dung or cow dung, okay? By the way, breathing those fumes and probably killing you from tuberculosis or lung cancer. If I'm one of those people in one of those countries, I'm probably going to talk to the Chinese and say, hey, F them. Can you build me a coal-fired power plant? Because we need to get our people into at least the 20th century, much less the 21st century. This should not even be a story because they're trying to convert the World Bank into a religion. And the global warming crowd is certainly a religion, believing in a deity that probably doesn't exist. Number 3, supply chains. Now, you've all heard the stories, okay? We can't ship this truck because there's a chip that does such and such, and that factory in China burned down, and we can't get chips. Okay, you've heard this, okay? There's supply chain problems. We can't get a chip for this. We can't get a motor for that. We can't get a relay for this. We can't get a diode for that. Because cars nowadays run on computers. They are chip heavy with technology. And Ford has a big problem because it's delayed deliveries of certain vehicles because it didn't have a certain object that's pretty important to a car, especially to a Ford. In fact, actually only to a Ford. And it's another example how supply chain challenges have hit the automakers. Okay. So what is it that Ford, think about it. What does a Ford have that absolutely no other car in the world has? And this is true. This is true. Only Fords have this accessory on their cars. No other car would ever consider having this accessory on their car other than Ford. What is it, you say? Is it a chip? Nope. Is it a motor? Nope. Is it a diode? Nope. Is it a relay? Nope. It's the blue oval badge that says Ford. That's right. The car company has run into supply constraints with the brand name badges and the nameplates that specify the model. That's according to people familiar with the matter. Now, both parts, both the ones that say Ford and the one that says F-150, they're having trouble with both of those parts. They're affixed to the vehicle's exterior, and they're important identifiers for the automaker's product. Okay? That's very iconic. And a company spokesman confirmed that it's held some vehicle shipments because of lack of Ford badges or F-150 badges, okay? And the shortage is impacting Ford's popular F-Series pickup trucks, among others. Now, Ford executives have considered some workarounds like 3D printing the insignia until the permanent ones can be obtained, but they didn't feel that the printed substitutes would meet quality standards. They'd be subpar. They don't want that. You don't want the blue oval that says Ford to look dopey, okay? Because that's your brand, all right? Now, the Ford spokesman said the company's building and shipping trucks with the blue oval badges and is retrofitting those without a Ford logo, delivering them to dealer. The company declined to commit on the 3D printing proposal. Shares of Ford fell 3.6% on Friday. Now, Ford on last Monday, said it expects to have about 40 to 50,000 vehicles in inventory at the end of the third quarter that couldn't be shipped because they're awaiting needed parts. Didn't say how many of those 50,000 were badges that actually said Ford. But the guy who makes them, it's a Michigan supplier. They're the ones who make badges for Ford in the past. They had to limit operations. That was starting in August because they had disclosed to Michigan regulators that it had discharged industrial chemicals into a local sewer system. So they got shut down and they had to hold back because of EPA stuff. Now, the supplier is called Tribar Technologies. They specialize in decorative exterior trim for automotive, including badges and lettering for vehicles. Now, the company's website shows it's made the insignia for Ford previously, showing the F-150 pickup truck logos and F-150 stickers. Why should this not even be a problem? What is one of the things in Business 101, okay, is you need to have more than one source for your stuff. Primary and secondary suppliers. Now, that's Business 101. And sometimes if it's a high-tech item, if it's a certain computer chip that 3 people in the world make and nobody else makes, okay, I get it. But this is a badge that said Ford. I have a question. Why would you even have outsourced this thing? Why would you have outsourced the iconic thing that makes your car a Ford? I'll tell you why. Because somebody did it cheaper than you. And I'll tell you another reason why they didn't get a secondary supplier. My opinion, I don't know this for a fact. Again, they wanted to be cheap. I can give these to you for $7 a piece. All right. Our secondary supplier are $10 a piece. Well, the secondary supplier gets zero business for 3 years straight. Guess what the secondary supplier does? Stops building product. Okay. Now, one of the reasons that they could sell them for $7 a piece instead of $10 a piece because they were pouring the hazardous waste down the sewer. They got caught with their hand in the cookie barrel. They screwed up. Now Ford is stuck. Okay. They didn't have a secondary supplier. If Ford had had 80% of the people, if Ford had 80% of their product manufactured by their primary supplier, Tribar Technologies, and maybe the other 20% by ABC Industries, or you figure out the name, and Tribar crap the bed, talk to ABC and say, look, what do we need to do to ramp this thing up, okay? But they didn't do that. Or what did Henry Ford do? He built darn near everything himself. But that takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of management, and quite often extra cost. Because we all know that the price of a car is expensive nowadays, okay? This should not be an issue because Ford, and it's just not Ford, it's all car companies. And actually what I'm seeing out there, many, if not all companies, they're limiting their suppliers to the guy who's the cheapest. Not the best, not the quickest, not the fastest, but the cheapest. And when the cheapest can't deliver, nobody else wants to. In fact, if you remember with the chips, why did they get into trouble in the first place, the car companies? Because during the recession, or during COVID, I should say, not the recession, but during COVID, they went to the chip makers and said, you know what? I know we have contracts with you for all these chips, but we're having trouble selling cars, so F you. We're just not going to buy them. 6, 8, 10, 12 months later, they said, yeah, we've changed our mind. Things aren't as bad as we thought they were with the pandemic. We'll take all those chips and then some, please. And the chip maker said, sorry, Charlie, you told us to go pound sand. Well, we pounded sand, and we now sell to other people. And they lost their mind, and they still haven't recovered. As most of them haven't. Who did? What's the big car that you see tons of nowadays? And there seem to be no shortages at all, although there are some shortages. Hyundais and Kias. Hyundai and Kia, the Korean manufacturer, said, you know what? I know things are tough, but we have a good relationship with you people. We'll keep buying the chips. Friends, they don't have a chip shortage because they treated their suppliers with respect. Nobody else did. And Hyundai is now eating their lunch. Ford cannot get the blue oval insignia that says Ford because they jobbed it out to the lowest bidder, and the lowest bidder is in trouble. That is a big problem for Ford that should never be. Now, the last story is the one that just blows my mind completely. And I got this from a variety of sources. Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and a publication in Spokane, Washington. I spent some time in Spokane, Washington. Love it. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. Spokane, Washington, and then into Idaho. I had some business there. But it's the Spokane Spokesman Review newspaper. And it has to do with they're having trouble getting beer. Okay. Now, what makes beer important? Lots of things. Okay. Hops, barley, clean water, electricity or natural gas for brewing. But think about what makes beer bubbly. And that's CO2. Okay. There's a national shortage of CO2. And that means beer as well as soda and a whole bunch of other stuff. There's a problem. In fact, No Lee Brewing House owner John Bryant in Spokane says carbon dioxide is used virtually everywhere in the brewing process. So it's been a shock that the cost of CO2 has tripled in the last 12 months. And I think to yourself, well, why is this? and the reason just blew my mind. Do you know where they get the vast majority of CO2 in this country? It comes from an extinct volcano in Mississippi called Jackson Dome. This is an extinct volcano that sits about 2,900 feet below the city of Jackson, Mississippi. Specifically, it's right below the Mississippi Coliseum, and it holds a massive reservoir of CO2 that's tapped, stored, and delivered to industries throughout the country, including brewers. Okay? Now, shortage demands began in the mid-2020s when the production of ethanol, which, again, is a carbon dioxide byproduct, slowed as people stayed home. Now, this summer, the problem became more acute when CO2 when the Jackson Dome became contaminated with gas from a nearby mine. Now, Brian says we hope to be patient, but the price keeps going up, supply keeps going down, and we don't know if we're going to continue to be making beer. Now, here's a question that I ask. If your main source of CO2 is an extinct volcano below the Mississippi Coliseum in Jackson, Mississippi, that's bizarre with a capital B. But here's the thing that's the most bizarre to me. And let's go back to story number 2. As well as some of story number 1. In fact, every story. What's the big thing? Oh, it's global warming. It's our carbon footprint. It's the fact that there's too much CO2 being emitted into the air. CO2, by the way, for those of you who don't know, is carbon dioxide. So, we have 2 big problems in this world. Number 1 is we don't have enough carbon dioxide to make beer. Number 2, we have too much carbon dioxide and the world's going to heat up. What is it, folks? Do we have too much carbon dioxide or do we have not enough carbon dioxide? Now, I guess like Mr. Milpass, the head of the World Bank, I'm not a scientist, okay? Those of you listening to the podcast that may be a scientist may be able to clear this up. But here's what I really don't get. Do we have a shortage of CO2, which is going to make us cut off our beer supply? Or do we have too much CO2, which is going to cause the oceans to just engulf the whole world? Which is it, friends? Because my small brain cannot wrap around the fact that it's both. That's it. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. James Strong Show at What's my email address? Oh, yeah, jamesstrongshow@hotmail.com. I had a brain fart there. That's my email address. Every week I get several, sometimes even more than several emails. I enjoy getting them from the listeners. I enjoy corresponding with you. Love to answer all your questions. You give suggestions for future podcasts. Those are always appreciated as well. Understand that thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing the podcast. Thank you you're the reason for its continued growth. I appreciate it. Pick up the podcast wherever you pick up your podcast, or jamesstrongshow@hotmail.com. I will send you a link upon publication. You can download it, listen to it at your leisure, and share it with your friends and family, and maybe even those you hate. That's it. We're done. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.